Thank you, Leslie. And hello, everyone. Good evening to my fellow Brits and good afternoon to those of you in the States, and hello to anyone who's on another time zone entirely. I want to kick off by telling you about an anti-Semitic episode that happened in Britain during July 2020, when a quite well-known celebrated British rapper called Wiley, who is known as the godfather of grime, with grime being an indigenous British subgenre of rap, spent an entire weekend tweeting pejoratively about Jews. To be precise, he started to tweet about his manager, who is Jewish and who he had various grievances against. But then he tweeted repeatedly over the course of the whole weekend that Jews are cowards, that Jews are snakes, that, as he put it, the people moaning about anti-Semitic are actually the most racist ones out here. He compared Jews to the Ku Klux Klan, suggested they control the police, and referring to Israel, tweeted that, as he put it, Jewish people illegally stealing land and killing people, but call you anti-Semitic when you call them out for it. In total, he tweeted 599 times in the space of a single weekend, with additional posts on a similar theme on Facebook and Instagram to a combined social media following of over 900,000 people, before the various social networks belatedly stepped in and shut down his accounts. Now, his tirade sparked a storm of outrage and a widespread 48-hour social media boycott in protest at the social media platforms. But Wiley himself doubled down in an extraordinary interview a few days later with Britain's best-known black community newspaper, which is called The Voice. In this interview, which was conducted by the arts and culture editor of the newspaper, he said, he talked about, quote, the Jewish community that I have experienced, the people I work with in the entertainment and music industry. He complained that, as he put it, these families are so rich. And then he said, they still see us as slaves. Slavery hasn't stopped. It's just dressed up in £1 million record deal. But all it is a bunch of black kids making these people millions and trillions. And then at the end of the black kid's career, he hasn't even got a property and they've got 10 properties and their kids have got wages to go to school forever. It's set up so that they win and we lose. Now, the editor who was interviewing him seemed to give credence to these views, writing in his commentary on this interview that, quote, the stranglehold one community seems to have over another in particular relation, but not confined to the music business, was not being posed from an ignorant perspective, but was the great unsaid outside of the black community. Now, I know that the phenomenon of prominent black artists, celebrities, or community figures making anti-Semitic remarks or describing the relationship between Jewish and black communities in terms of economic exploitation is perhaps not so uncommon in the United States, but in the United Kingdom, it is very, very unusual, to say the least. There have been one or two precedents. In 2017, for example, a well-known BBC TV presenter called Reggie Yates praised younger black artists who didn't sign for major record labels by saying they're independent, they're not managed by some random fat Jewish guy from Northwest London, they're managed by their brethren. But generally speaking, concerns about anti-Semitism in the UK have always focused on the political extremes of far right and far left, or anti-Semitism from within Britain's Muslim communities. There has been relatively little friction historically between Jewish and black communities in Britain. So Wiley's anti-Semitic social media rant and his sympathetic platform in the Voice newspaper came as a shock for many British Jews. Of course, we know anti-Semitism can occur anywhere, but until this point, most British Jews had not really thought about anti-Semitism from within Britain's black communities as a problem worthy of their attention, and certainly not one with its own specific characteristics and dynamics. Now, this episode, as I said, happened in July 2020, which was, of course, 2 months after the murder of George Floyd, which triggered a wave of protests and anti-racist consciousness, not just in the United States. It had a profound impact on many different aspects of life in the UK as well, as American interpretations and discourses of race and racism have kind of been superimposed onto the politics of the UK. There are several different groups using the name Black Lives Matter in the UK, some of which sprung up in response to the killing of George Floyd and were opportunistic efforts by small far-left groups. But the biggest and most significant Black Lives Matter UK organisation has been active since at least 2016 and is very much influenced and inspired by the American organisation of the same name that we heard about from Ricky earlier. There have been personal contacts between leading figures on both sides. The creation of BLM UK was welcomed in a public statement in 2016 by Black Lives Matter US, and the UK branch or the UK organisation has been endorsed by Patrisse Cullors. Now, BLM UK follows the same radical analysis of society. In a statement after the killing of George Floyd, they said, "We're guided by a commitment to dismantle imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and the state structures that disproportionately harm Black people in Britain and around the world." So to that extent, it's familiar stuff. But the group had not had much attention in the UK until the killing of George Floyd, when Black Lives Matter as an idea and as a slogan was thrust into the spotlight. At that point, the sense of a compelling need to address systemic racial discrimination and do it through this framing and slogan of Black Lives Matter became pervasive in the UK last year. This had widespread support in sections of the British public. After the murder of George Floyd, BLM UK raised over £1 million through public donations to a GoFundMe page, even though the organisation was little more than a verified Twitter account with no publicly known or recognised leaders or spokespeople, very little public profile, and a radical political programme that very few people in Britain would actually support. Black sportsmen and women, TV presenters, and other public figures of colour spoke often for the first time in Britain about their experiences of daily discrimination, and again, for the first time, they were pretty much always heard with respect and sympathy. Companies and organizations, large and small, made statements to their staff, to their customers, and to the public, declaring their commitment not just to anti-racism, but to self-examination of their own systemic unconscious failings. Within the Jewish community, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is the UK's primary representative Jewish body, held a commission on racial inclusivity, led by a prominent Black Jewish journalist, to address the problem of prejudice and discrimination faced by Jews of colour from within the Jewish community. This commission took evidence for months and recently reported. The National Trust, which is a cherished institution in Britain that owns and manages some of Britain's best loved historic stately homes, pledged to examine which of the grand properties under their care had benefited from the wealth that the British Empire derived from slavery. Their conclusion was about a third of them, actually. Even British horticulture came under the microscope, with a public debate over whether the language of native plants versus invasive species was evidence of institutionalized racism literally rooted into the gardens of England. Those of you who are fans of football, right, or soccer, this is an American conference, if you watch the recent European Football Championships that took place in June and July, you will have seen the England football team players all taking the knee before they kicked off every match in that tournament. And this has been the custom followed by every Premier League football team for the whole of last season and the back end of the season before. In fact, for a while after the killing of George Floyd, when they first started taking the knee, every team in the Premier League replaced the players' names on the backs of their shirts with the slogan Black Lives Matter. Right now, you might look at this and think, wow. But the interesting thing about this is how this usage of political methods and slogans and actions taken from America were actually deployed in a subtly but importantly different way in the UK. As you may know, in the United States, the practice of athletes or sports people taking the knee before a match began with American footballer Colin Kaepernick, who knelt during the national anthem before a game in 2016 to protest against racial injustice in America. And he made it clear that he had deliberately chosen the national symbols of America, the flag and the anthem, as the focus of his protest, saying, "I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses Black people and people of color. And when there's significant change," he said, "and I feel the flag represents what it's supposed to represent, this country is representing people the way it's supposed to, I'll stand." Now, the difference is when England footballers took the knee before their matches, They did so when they were about to play for the England national team to literally represent the nation. And they stood together and sang the national anthem before they play. They didn't take the knee during the anthem. They didn't choose to follow Kaepernick's lead by making their protest directly against national symbols of England. Instead, they sang the anthem and then they kneeled. And it's just an interesting way of how methods of protest can be taken and co-opted from one environment, but deployed in a different environment in it to take on a different meaning. Now, this group of footballers that played for England in this summer's European Championships are so interesting because they are incredibly popular with the public precisely because they are young, they are diverse, they are modest, but they're also socially conscious and patriotic. Several of the players in the team took on social and political campaigns during lockdown against child poverty and against racism. And they have become held up as kind of a model of a new type of English patriotism and are representing a different type of English identity as a result of this. So they take the knee to protest against systemic racism in the UK, while also speaking of their pride in representing their country on the football field. Now, their decision to take the knee was criticised before the tournament by various leading Conservative politicians and government ministers who I think saw an opportunity for some culture war manoeuvring off the back of this, but it backfired with the public. This criticism backfired because the team was so popular. Now, the players themselves, importantly, along with their clubs and TV broadcasters and the sports authorities, have insisted repeatedly that they take the knee as a non-political gesture to raise awareness of racism and not as a sign of support for the Black Lives Matter organization, which is recognized as a radical organization. I'll come back to that later. Now, the broad thrust of all these responses in the UK to the murder of George Floyd may be familiar, even if the specific examples aren't, especially to those of you in the United States, but this is my whole point. George Floyd was an American, killed by an American police officer in a city that most people in Britain would not be able to place on a map. And yet the reaction in Britain was just as if it had happened here, and as if it reflected deep systemic racism in Britain itself. Now, there are, of course, similarities, important similarities in the way that racism plays out in the UK and in the US, but there are also significant differences, both in their origins and how they manifest. Nevertheless, Black Lives Matter became the new framing through which all understandings of racism are now filtered in the UK. And in turn, this understanding of racism has been applied liberally across so many different sections of society. Now, I think it's understandable and it's correct that many people saw this as an opportunity to draw attention to the many different examples of both superficial and systemic racism in Britain today. But what is remarkable, as I said, is the way in which anti-racist campaigners, and particularly those from the radical left, drew inspiration from American political radicalism to provide the language and framing through which to do it. Now, this has happened even though the foundations of racism in both countries are profoundly different. Of course, today's racism in America builds on a long history on American soil of slavery, the Civil War, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and so on and so on. Britain's communities of colour, in terms of substantial numbers and presence in Britain, are much more recent and date largely from post-war, post-Second World War immigration from former British colonies, primarily in the Caribbean and in the Indian subcontinent, to the United Kingdom. Now, Britain was not uniformly white before then by any means, but it was only in the early 1950s that communities of colour started to grow to a significant size, whereby their presence became a subject of political and public debate. And as this non-white immigration to Britain grew, it was genuinely and intrinsically linked to the issue of decolonization and the end of the British Empire, because this is where these new communities were coming from. And these two questions of immigration and decolonization were themselves wrapped up in this new political idea of anti-racism in the 1960s because of the racial discrimination that these communities then faced when they arrived in Britain. So Britain's connection, of course, to slavery was in some ways just as old as America's, but it took place one step removed because it didn't happen on British soil. Instead, it was via empire and it was via colonialism. And it is colonialism that is Europe's original sin, if you like, that shapes European and British understandings of racism. And this is where Israel comes in. because this history of colonialism and empire is the prism through which much of the left perceives Israel. Now, there's a long history for this. This linkage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with colonialism goes back to the anti-Israel propaganda of the PLO in its early years, of the rejectionist Arab states, of Soviet anti-Zionism. I'm not going to go through all that history now. The point is, this discourse has been around for a lot longer than the Black Lives Matter movement, but the impact of Black Lives Matter is to reinforce its dominance as the primary explanation. The anti-colonial explanation is the primary explanation of this conflict, particularly amongst left-wing and liberal audiences, and that then connects it to perceptions of racism within Western societies. Framing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in this way as an anti-colonial struggle inevitably positions it as a racial conflict and as a manifestation of global white supremacy. And therefore, if you accept that Israel is a settler colonial enterprise, opposing racism obliges you to also oppose Zionism. This is the explanation that now makes sense to politically conscious teenagers and students who don't know anything about Israel and Palestine, but who have absorbed the argument that the world is organized to protect and privilege systemic white supremacy and white privilege. It simplifies a complicated conflict, but in terms that fit a broader, simplistic explanation of the world. If all oppressors are white, and if Israel is the oppressor in Palestine, then logically Israel must also be white, as must its supporters amongst diaspora Jewish communities. And in this context, white is not just a physical description, it's a political description of those who are privileged, who are powerful, who are importantly incapable of suffering racism and share the collective guilt for the actual real racism suffered by people of color. Now, this obviously leaves little space for recognition of anti-Semitism as a form of racism at all, but even worse, it means that Jewish complaints about anti-Semitism are themselves further evidence of this Jewish privilege. Now, the recent conflict in Israel and Gaza in May showed that the experience and the impacts of these Black Lives Matter campaigns is to radicalize and universalize the way in which the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is now understood. You know, a common refrain on social media, especially during that recent conflict, was that this is not a conflict, right? In other words, this is not a case of two rival national movements in conflict over the same piece of land. It is instead a case of a white colonial oppressor and a colonized, oppressed people of color, foreign settlers versus indigenous natives. You know, in this narrative, all Israelis are settlers from Poland or Brooklyn, and all Palestinians have lived in the land of Israel since the days of Jesus. Now, conflicts involving Israel have always triggered anti-Semitic reactions in the diaspora. We saw this in the UK in May. But this time around, those reactions were especially extreme. And I think this new framing for the conflict is part of the reason why. Because this is no longer simply an overseas conflict. It's increasingly seen by many activists as a manifestation of the same racism that blights our own societies. And just as racism cannot be compromised with, and nor can colonialism, therefore Israel cannot be compromised with. And by that, I mean the existence of Israel. If racism is to be eliminated, so must Israel. And incidentally, this is why I believe the wording, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, regarding the view that the existence of a state of Israel as a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. I believe this is why this wording causes so much trouble for many of Israel's opponents on the radical left. Because if Zionism is a manifestation of colonialism, colonialism can be nothing other than a racist endeavor, and therefore nor can Israel. And of course, this idea that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is best understood as a case of settler colonialism has particular resonance in the UK because Britain was the colonial power in Mandate Palestine. However, as the radical left has often found with a lot of its theories about racism, Jews and anti-Semitism get in the way because we don't fit. And it was an issue to do with Jews and anti-Semitism that was one of the obstacles that tripped up the UK's Black Lives Matter movement in June last year. And I'll explain what happened. In June last year, quite a well-known TV actor called Maxine Peake, who was very left-wing, supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, gave an interview about a month after the killing of George Floyd, in which she said, amongst lots of other topics, systemic racism is a global issue. The tactics used by the police in America, kneeling on George Floyd's neck, that was learned from seminars with Israeli secret services. Right, now this is the idea Ricky touched on earlier, somehow directly or indirectly placing responsibility for George Floyd's murder at the door of Israel. Right, now Maxine Peake had said it wouldn't have caused that much fuss. It became a much bigger issue in the UK because a prominent Labour Party politician called Rebecca Long-Bailey, who at that time was Labour's education spokesperson, tweeted a link to this interview where Maxine Peake had said this with a very supportive comment that Maxine Peake is an absolute diamond. That's what she said. Now, this made it one of the first political tests for the new Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer, who had replaced Jeremy Corbyn 2 months earlier with a vow to repair the party's broken relations with the Jewish community. And he moved pretty quickly to sack Rebecca Long-Bailey from her position as the Labour Party's education spokesperson. And he said it was because the article contained anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, specifically this one about the killing of George Floyd. However, this was not the end of the matter, right? 3 days later, after Rebecca Long-Bailey was sacked, Black Lives Matter UK tweeted, in an obvious reference to this, they tweeted, as Israel moves forward with the annexation of the West Bank and mainstream British politics is gagged of the right to critique Zionism and Israel's settler colonial pursuits, we loudly and clearly stand beside our Palestinian comrades, free Palestine. And it then followed that with a thread of 11 different tweets linking to loads of pro-Palestinian articles, including ones supporting BDS, ones claiming that cynical and false accusations of anti-Semitism are conflated with opposition to Israel's policies, and so on and so on and so on. Now, this thread garnered tens of thousands of likes and shares. Of course, the anti-Zionism in the thread was not such a surprise. Linking the anti-racist struggle in Britain to the Palestinian cause had been a consistent part of BLM's agenda in the UK as in the US. But the comment in the first tweet that claimed mainstream British politics is gagged of the right to critique Zionism was seen as anti-Semitic. And along with their calls to defund the police and bring down capitalism, which had already caused a lot of controversy, it added to the growing sense that BLM UK is not an organization that mainstream voices wanted to be associated with. 3 days later, the Premier League, one of the main football authorities in the UK, announced that its support for Black Lives Matter as a campaign did not endorse the BLM UK organization, and they called it a risk posed by groups that seek to hijack popular causes and campaigns. Now, put to one side whether BLM UK were really hijacking it or it was the Premier League jumping on the BLM bandwagon. The point is, football has continued to promote Black Lives Matter as an idea and feels it is able to do this while separating itself from BLM UK as an organization and their radical politics. Whether that works in practice is another debate. Now, I'm going to finish just by picking up on this because, it would be easy to dismiss this episode with BLM UK as something you expect from a radical politics. They get a bit of moment of popularity. As soon as people work out what they're really about, they get scared and they back away. But I think what happened there, and I think what happened with Wiley, revealed an unnoticed and unwelcome legacy of the Jewish community's campaign against anti-Semitism in the Labour Party while it was under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership from 2015 to April 2020. And it's a legacy that I think not enough people in the Jewish community have really picked up on yet. Now, that period when Labour Party was under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership was one of repeated public and very nasty arguments between the Jewish community and the Labour Party over anti-Semitism in Labour. It definitely damaged Corbyn's leadership to some degree, and it contributed to a certain extent to his defeat in the 2019 general election. It wasn't the primary reason, but it contributed to it. Now, the view that many British Jews had that Corbyn had permitted or even encouraged an anti-Semitic culture in the Labour Party has been endorsed by the UK's statutory anti-discrimination regulator that ruled that the Labour Party had unlawfully discriminated against Jewish members. In fact, a lot of British Jews would go even further and say Corbyn is personally anti-Semitic. Meanwhile, for many other minority communities, and especially communities of colour, Corbyn is widely seen as one of the few members of parliament who stood up for their interests and campaigned against the racism they suffer when it was unfashionable to do so. One of the most popular and common social media memes of Jeremy Corbyn is an old press photograph of him being arrested on an anti-apartheid demonstration in London in the early 1980s. Now, typically for Corbyn, it wasn't a demonstration organised by the main anti-apartheid movement that had a lot of mainstream support, including from other MPs. It was a smaller, much more radical splinter group. But that's not the point. The point is Corbyn and Labour more broadly were seen as the party that stands up for people of colour and stands up against racism and discrimination. And the Conservatives who won that election are perceived as a party that does the opposite. And the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is himself accused of having made racist and discriminatory comments in the past. Now, whether these are accurate perceptions is beside the point. They are widespread. And for some people, I think there is a sense, especially some people within communities of colour, there is a sense that British Jews abused our power to bring down Corbyn to protect ourselves without considering the impact that would have on them. And I think this is a lesson for us that while racism divides communities, in a world of competitive victimhood, so can our responses to it. Now this, as I said, all went largely unseen by the Jewish community at the time. And I think this is partly because Britain's Black and Jewish communities exist largely in parallel. For all the mundane interactions every day between Black and Jewish people in this country, there's little by way of formalized engagement between them as communities. And there's certainly nothing to match the extensive efforts to build Muslim Jewish networks over many years. So this all means when Wiley went on his anti-Semitic social media rant, and when BLM UK tweeted their conspiratorial theory, it came as a shock for many British Jews, and the community lacked points of engagement with the Black community through which to manage these moments of friction. So what can be done to address this problem, to prevent a wider schism from opening up between Britain's Black and Jewish communities? Because I think there's still a sense there oughtn't to be conflict. There is a great deal of anti-racist work done by Jewish community organizations, and there has been since the 1960s. And this could be the foundation of meaningful engagement. But I think before that, and for that to bear fruit, we need to establish a shared understanding of racism that is wide enough to include anti-Semitism, but not so diluted that it erases the specific features of either anti-Semitism or racism against people of color. You know, we've just been through a really bruising experience for British Jews in May this year with a huge surge in anti-Semitism. Fueled by extreme anti-Semitic reactions to what happened in Israel and Gaza. A few weeks after that, you had England's Black footballers targeted with a wave of racist abuse online because England lost the final of the European Football Championships. We need to find an understanding of racism that can capture both of those phenomena and come up with a solution and a way of dealing with them that deals with both. And this can't be based on either competing for attention or simplistic binaries that leave no space for Jews or for all the different contours of different types of racism we face. I think if we can find that, then we can move forward. Thank you.